Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of IWSCC's Empowering Equality podcast. My name is Deidre Guy, and I am the president and founder of the Inclusive Workplace and Supply Council of Canada, or IWSCC, if you're short on time. And we just want to let you know that our podcasts are produced by Pod Supply. And if you're watching this on YouTube, the ASL interpretation is sponsored by RBC Royal Bank and supplied by Maple Communications Canada. I'm super excited to have our guest on today. He has a long history of working and volunteering in the disability community and has been involved with the Ontario Association for Developmental Education for 18 years, serving as a member at large, president and past president. Hubert served as the president of the Council for Exceptional Children for London Middlesex. He's on the L'Arche London Board of Directors, and before retirement was a special education specialist teacher in a mostly self-contained classroom for 17 years. He taught students with a wide range of intellectual and multiple disabilities, and also engaged in a year-long teacher work exchange to Australia for the year of 2010. So today he joins us as a member of the Board of Directors for a Canadian nonprofit called Every Canadian Counts. Please welcome Hubert Van Niekirk.
Well, that was a lot. Anyway, thank you, David, for that public service announcement.
You're quite welcome. Yeah, we're interested in the last thing that we spoke about, where you're a member of the board of directors for Every Canadian Counts. What is Every Canadian Counts, and what is the organization's goal or mission?
The basic mission, in a long sentence, is that what we are trying to do is put into place a publicly funded national disability insurance program for all people with long-term and chronic disabilities in Canada, and that would be from cradle to grave. So that's kind of in a long sentence. So that's what our goal is.
So how long have you been part of Every Canadian Counts, or ECC, and what made you decide to even join something like this?
Yeah. So when I retired about 6 years ago from education in a self-contained classroom, it was very clear that people with disabilities and just were not getting what they needed. There was just so many services lacking. We often wondered, once students graduated and I taught in high school, what their future would hold, and it just looked bleak. So when I retired, I thought there's got to be more I can do, and so I joined Every Canadian Counts about 4 years ago, and just kind of looking around and getting in touch with people, and they said, "Well, have you heard of Every Canadian Counts?" So that's when I found Every Canadian Counts, headed up by Dr. Bill Cowie. And so now I'm currently the vice chair for Every Canadian Counts.
How long has the organization been around?
It's, I think, officially started in 2015.
Okay, so for quite some time, actually.
It is, yeah. What really happened is that the Canada Accessibility, or the Accessibility Canada Act, took up a lot of the energy. The focus of things went there. And then there was now, of course, is the Canada Disability Benefit, which is taking up all the oxygen. And so I think, I know governments could do more than one thing at a time, but they tend to sort of focus in one area. So the Canada Disability Benefit is now well on its way to being approved, and hopefully before the next election is implemented. And so I think the time is right. Carla Quadro, the past Minister of Disabilities, sort of said, okay, what's the next big thing? And I thought she was kind of looking at our organization to say the next big thing is this National Disability Insurance Plan. Sure. And it's bigger than almost any plan that's out there currently.
So how does your role support Every Canadian Counts? And I'm interested to know who else is involved and sort of what experiences at the table in terms of the organization itself.
Yeah, we have six, I believe, on the board of directors. We have 3 on the advisory committee, including Bruce Bonahady, who was the architect of the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia back in 2010. And Michael Kendrick, who's also world known for his involvement with things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And and we're made up, and we have about 6 people on a steering committee, all volunteers as well. We meet on every 2 weeks, and we kind of go over what we've been doing on the last 2 weeks and what we're looking forward to in the next month or so. And it's made up of about evenly people with disabilities and people without disabilities. So I'm active, probably the most active at the present time, along with Bill Cowie. We do most of the interviews and the behind the scenes work and in front of the scenes work. So it is most of us that are, mostly Bill and I, that are pushing this forward.
So what kind of activities have you been up to until this point? I know you're doing a lot of speaking and just trying to get the message out there. Has it been just largely that the whole time? What other sorts of things have you guys done?
Yeah, we've certainly talked to a lot of politicians, and it doesn't seem to be a hard sell when we talk to politicians. They think it's a great idea. In the last federal, the Liberal Party convention, there was actually 6 electoral district associations who recommended putting forth this plan, at least doing the research into whether we should have it. And so our main focus now is to try to get the general public, because I was asked by another politician about 2 weeks ago that said, well, how come I haven't heard about it? So it really is to get the constituency for people that don't know about it, to say that this is a possibility. So we need stories from people that are perhaps in a bad way, who can see that they need more. Right now, the services are they're inconsistent. They're scattered all over the place. They're nightmarish to navigate. And the waiting lists are just getting longer and longer. I heard a statistic the other day that there's 40,000 people in Ontario alone on waiting lists to get into supported housing.
Oh wow!
And but we're hoping that perhaps the funding model will change, which they're talking about changing to called Journey to Belonging, where the individuals will get the funding and then choose their agency, which is basically how a national disability insurance plan or scheme works in Australia. The funding sort of first is identified as going to the person with a disability or their family. Well, things are changing, I believe, in that area.
That's great to hear. So the insurance plan that you're proposing at Every Canadian Counts is the plan for Canadians with disabilities, but based on an existing plan from Australia. So could you tell us a little bit more about how that works? How do Australians qualify for the program? And I'm curious to know if the program, is there any differentiation between people born with disabilities or those who acquire them later in life?
Right. I'll try to get all those questions.
I have them written down. I can remind you.
I'll start with the last one. It's easy. I can remember that one. Born with a disability or acquire them later in life makes no difference. They're covered. When you're talking about how do they qualify, it's based on what I would call a functional analysis, not necessarily a diagnosis, but the person is assessed by experts that are in whether they're doctors or accredited assessors that would assess somebody on what they need. So it gets rid of kind of jumping through the hoop, or do they have this or do they have that? It's based on what they need. And it's also non-means tested, which means that it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. If you have a child with a disability or you gain a disability during your life, you don't have to qualify. You don't have to prove how poor you are again. It's an entitlement that if you have that disability, you get that money. And some might say, well, it should be kept for the poor. But I don't think it's fair either just because somebody has a good job that those costs wouldn't be covered by what I would say the community, which is Canada. So it's one plan for all Canadians.
And those circumstances can certainly change for people. And not only that, but the costs for certain types of disabilities can be quite heavy, quite high. So even if they have a good job, it still might be a struggle for them to manage those additional costs.
Yeah. There's people, going to the food bank that have $1 million houses and 2 cars in the driveway. So it doesn't always matter what your income is. If you're in a bad way, you're in a bad way, and that's without the disability. So,
and I know that you and I had spoken in the past, and if I understand correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong, My understanding that Australia has done sort of a second iteration of the program because they discovered that there were some folks within the country that were missing in terms of getting that the disability benefit.
Yes, I have yet to go through the whole plan. I've heard the highlights, but they just completed a major review because the costs were far higher now than what they were when they started, for various reasons. The plan currently has about 600,000 people on the plan. 375,000 of those which had never been on any kind of assistance before. So they managed to find people that were hard to reach, fallen through the cracks, and it also added a whole lot of the part of the reason that the cost kind of ballooned. A whole lot more young people now with early intervention are getting on the plan instead of waiting until later on in life to get diagnosed or to get what their needs might be. So there's a lot more young people, a lot of just young kids that are on the plan that weren't on it before. They've also included now mental health, which was not on the plan initially. So the costs have gone, I think, from what they had thought would be about 10 million to 52 billion, or sorry, 10 billion to 52 billion dollars now. And part of the cost overruns where there was fraud. There was people now that they're looking at have already thrown off the plan and because of illegal activities. There has been some larger corporations as well, and probably small ones too, who have just taken advantage of the system, have charged too much, or it looked like they were just like a blank check. And there were still people who were not being served. So they found all those things out that during this recent review, where there was 222 recommendations for improvements. And with sort of a caveat that it doesn't mean we're going to reduce the cost of the plan, because more people are going to go on and we're going to be more efficient. So they're not talking about, cutting it by 10 billion. They're not necessarily cutting anything. It's just going to be more efficient and more inclusive. Well, what we're sort of saying is that Canada can start exactly at the end of that review.
Learn from their mistakes. Yeah. Well, that's a great way to go. And I'm glad that it doesn't rely on a diagnosis, because with IWSCC, we work with businesses that are disabled owned as well as veteran owned. And we do require something of a paperwork flow to prove the disability. And so we'll have many folks that have to go through the diagnosis journey. And it's not fast. Folks will say, I can have that done in a month. And I think, okay, well, I'd love to see that. And I hope that you do. But I don't, in my experience, that's not going to be what happens. So that's really great that you don't have to go through that particular barrier. And if I understand correctly, it's not like some programs that we have in Canada where you have to reestablish your disability on an annual basis. Is it? It's there, and you just can count on the money. You don't have to panic every year when your renewal comes out.
If you've got cerebral palsy or you've got multiple sclerosis, you've got those. And if you've got Down syndrome, you have that. So the program and the plan for each person can be adjusted somewhat over time. But, keep in mind, this is for what we call a long-term chronic disabilities. So that's specifically what this is for. So many do have short-term disabilities, and even sometimes a long-term disability at work may run out after a certain period of time too, I suppose. So then they would qualify for this plan.
So I'm interested in the funding of it. Like how much, we talked a bit about what it costs for Australians. Are we thinking that that's roughly what it would cost for Canadians? I think our populations are fairly similar. Is there a differentiation because of geography? And is it like another expense for Canadians? Does it somehow pay for itself? How does that all work?
Yeah. Getting right into the nitty gritty of money. I think the way it started, and it's possible that the government is now topping it up because of the cost overruns. That's sort of what I'm getting the idea that maybe it is being topped up. Initially, it was basically half of 1%, and I think that worked out to about $350 per wage earner that was taken off the paycheck just like Canada Pension Plan or employment insurance, comes off your check, and it went into what they called a National Disability Insurance Agency, like a fund that was set up separately, just like Canada Pension Plan is, so that if you needed it, you got it. And so the people themselves were paying for this plan. And it would be nice maybe to, and I don't actually have the numbers, whether that's still the way it is or whether the government is topping it up, but I think they are topping it up because the costs are quite high now. And maybe it's a bit too much for just straight taxpayer, but it was self-sufficient. So I'm not sure where it's at that point now.
You said something to me when we were talking a couple of months ago, and it really hit home with me. And I've actually shared that with quite a few other people, just looking for their reaction. And you said to me that no one should have to pay for their disability. And I thought that was so profound and really had me really thinking about that. And it's absolutely true. People don't really get it that, first of all, there's a good chance we're all going to wind up with a disability at some point in our lives. And secondly, it's all just a stroke of luck, whether or not you're born with a disability. It's not anything that you have done pre-birth to give yourself a disability. So I do agree that people should not have to pay for their own disability. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of things the insurance program would cover? I mean, we talk about support, but what does some of that support actually look like?
Well, it could be psychological support, could be professional like therapy, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, house modifications, vehicle modifications and purchases, wheelchairs that aren't covered, modifications to wheelchairs, pretty much everything, from almost, if you've got a long term and you need a walker, it's not, that big a cost, but it could easily be $200,000-$300,000 a year that it would cost, which is already costing some people. The chair of Every Canadian Counts has multiple disabilities. He does talk through a trach. He's a quadriplegic. And, his costs alone are phenomenal because he has 24-hour care and needs it to survive. And, on that note, if we're talking about Jonathan Marchand, he was in a pilot project to get out of long-term care. And because he fenced himself in front of the Quebec legislative grounds. And after about 9 days, somebody from the party or the government the provincial government came and talked to him and agreed to set him up in a pilot project on his own apartment. So he was able to, we're kind of talking about young people in long-term care where they actually, most don't belong. I do know some people actually who love it there. And one young lady said to me, "These are all like my grandma and grandpa." And so, but I think the majority of people that do not have developmental disabilities would prefer to have their own place where they can eat when they want to, they can go to the bathroom when they need to, and he's a good example of that. But the year is up, and he's still in his apartment, but he feels like he's on parole and that they can pull that plug anytime, and he really does not want to go back to long-term care. And what he's doing now is trying to fight for other people in long-term care to be able to also get out and live on their own. And certainly research, what I've heard about, it's cheaper to actually have somebody in their own home than it is in long-term care.
Yeah, I would think so.
It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, and give people that sense of agency to be able to live on their own and be as self-sufficient as possible. And now you spoke about this a little bit earlier, and I'm just curious if there's anything else that you can think of, any sort of lessons learned from the successes or failures of the Australian program that Canadians could benefit from.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful of large private enterprise where they're getting shareholders, and big corporations are knocking small agencies off to the side. In a way, Bruce Bonney had actually, after he did the research, seemed to apologize in a way that it really pushed a lot of people out, smaller agencies. And something recently I've heard is that if you're going to be able to compete in this type of a situation, you have to have about $30 million a year to be able to survive as an agency. So there's a lot more collaboration will happen between agencies and partnerships formed. But the large shareholders, similar to what I would say long-term care homes, where profit is more important than care. And I think that's my biggest takeaway from what's been going on. And I think they're going to try to push back a bit to go to smaller companies and they could be private, but just not where you're into your large corporations where all they're worried about is making money.
So when the person receives their insurance benefit, is it then up to them to determine where they're going to for care, or are there people guiding them and steering them in a particular direction? I'm just curious to know how these larger conglomerates can, sort of take over providing the large share of the care for people.
Yeah, I think part of it is possibly that they're the ones now that have the services, and but it is up to the individual, either the person with a disability or their family if they need the family. But they can still elect then to say, okay, here I have this kind of money, I'm going to give it to this agency, and this is where I'm going to get my services. So they do have that option, and a lot of people are choosing that. So to choose an agency that works best for them, and direct the money to them.
I'm super excited that the inclusion of invisible disabilities is a factor for this insurance, because I'm always ranting on about how so many of us are suffering from trauma, past traumas. Trauma gets handed down from generation to generation. And if we can start to deal with people as they're young who are suffering from that trauma or as a result of trauma, and help them recover and learn ways to cope with the trauma that don't include inflicting trauma on their offspring or on other people around their lives, I just feel like, life could be so much easier for so many people. And it sounds like this could be a method to be able to tackle that and allow people right from the beginning to manage effectively what they're dealing with, including trauma.
Yeah, and trauma, certainly even through poverty and not being able to afford things for yourself, situations where, single parents mostly would be single mothers with 2 or 3 kids who cannot afford the food to give to the kids, as like a disabled person can't afford. And then the next thing you know, the agency's there to pick up the kids because there's not enough there. Hopefully this will help a lot of the people out. There's what they do in Australia as well as a parent, and again, mostly ladies, mostly women that would quit their job and take care of the child with a disability. And it's changing somewhat. There are more men doing that too, but it certainly traditionally it was more women that would leave their job. But now caregivers actually get paid. So the person, the mother or the father can get paid for the caregiving, or they can hire somebody to come in and do the caregiving. And when they do that, they can go back to work, they can go back to school, they can become contributing members as far as income tax goes. The person with the disability can be supported to go to work. And I think maybe that's where, agencies like yourself come in, where you can find work for people and with support. So until they don't need it anymore. And I don't know how long that lasts, but I'm sure that it would be at least a year that you could have support to train somebody at a job. So there again, you have more jobs created because there's caregiver jobs created. We're a shortage of caregivers, I know, but if it's perhaps pay more. Every place right now seems like they're short of workers, and I say bring on artificial intelligence so they can take some workload away. But we can be more efficient, I think, in the way that things are done, and so.
Well, and also I think if those caregivers aren't necessarily relegated largely to long-term care or those types of institutions where they're reliant on lower wages and working short-staffed all the time, and I have family in long-term care, working in long-term care, so I know the pain. So when there is more of these opportunities to work directly one-on-one in someone's home or something like that, I think that might give those workers a little a happier place to work, I think. And so you may find that the long-term care situation, I think, is probably a lot of people are shying away from working in that, and which is leading to a shortage in staff, unfortunately. This might be a different type that's more welcome for folks that are working in that area. I'm going to be be a little bit of a devil's advocate here for a moment. This is a question that struck me again when we were first talking about this. And I'm curious to know, how does this program, how does it consider individuals who have actually acquired their disability through what we might call something self-inflicted, for example, smoking, or perhaps drinking and driving and winding up with a disability? Does the program differentiate in those circumstances?
It's a question that I don't have a direct answer to, but I see no reason why it wouldn't be. If you, because of that, have a long-term disability, I would say absolutely that in what I've know of the program, that would be covered. But it's just...
And so you think it's covered in Australia?
I do believe so. I think it's all long-term chronic disability. So if you acquire that one way or the other, I do believe that's covered.
I mean, I don't think that people are necessarily heading out to drive drunk so they can acquire a disability to get on government benefit. Like, that seems like a long stretch for people. But I know that will be a question that, certain folks in society would be interested.
I remember hearing that same question for workers' comp. They've got a pension for life.
Yes.
But not too many people go and cut off their arm just so they can collect. So I don't really see that as really being a huge contributor.
Let's hope. Yes. So how is this program different from the current disability benefit that the government is working on? Will this fill gaps in that program?
The way I see it, and I think it's true, is that people have to differentiate between poverty and disability. The Canada Disability Benefit is geared towards persons with disability in poverty, and only a few people are going to qualify for that. It does absolutely nothing for the disability. You know what I mean? It really, they're still, if they need work on their wheelchair. So I kind of look at it kind of simplistically. So let's say they get an extra few dollars in a month, enough for groceries to sort of get them to that poverty level where they can just barely maybe get by. Are they going to spend it on groceries, or are they going to spend it on the wheelchair so they can get to the grocery store? You need both. And while we fully support the Canada Disability Benefit, because it will help people in poverty with disabilities, but it will do nothing technically for the actual disability. It'll fill their stomach, so it won't get worse. But they should really be looked at as two separate things. And that's a very small population, if you will. It's big enough, mind you, of people that have poverty and a disability. But there's still hundreds of thousands of people that it leaves out that need services.
I think also when you include invisible disabilities and disabilities related to mental health and poverty, a lot of those go hand in hand. I see that in my everyday life with folks who live in my neighborhood. So, and their problem is that they qualify for a benefit, but as soon as they start to make some money, then they have to pay back some of that benefit. So it's almost geared to keep them at that level of never getting off of the benefit. And, poverty or in many cases below poverty level is still trying to
I look at it as what they call a spiral, but it's a downward spiral because the extra in Ontario they gave an extra 5%, which doesn't even keep up near to what inflation, and there had been no increases for at least 3 years, and so they're still negative, way behind. I just did a quick calculation the other day when somebody said 80% of their money goes to rent from the Ontario Disability Support Program. So you do a quick calculation. When you go to qualify for a mortgage, you can only have about 30% of your cost should go towards a mortgage and 40% for family income. So when you think of, when I did the calculations, actually, if you go on 30%, it would be a $1,200 a month rent property, and you would need to make $48,000 a year to be able to meet those things so that you could actually have what I would call a normal life to be able to enjoy some things. Your disability should not mean you can't enjoy anything. And there's so many people that have disabilities that are on ODSP, and they're just kept poor and way below the poverty line. There should be no reason for that. So just for $1,200 a month to qualify for a mortgage, you would need $48,000 a year. Now we know in Toronto, for instance, it's going to be $2,200. So it's not nearly enough money. And so if there was funding available for their disability that they would receive for that, then that would certainly go a long way with supporting them.
I was going to say, good luck finding a place for $1,200 a month, especially in the city, in any kind of cities, which of course it's better off for a lot of folks, particularly with mobility disabilities, to be in a city type location because of the extra supports like Wheel-Trans and just overall accessibility in smaller towns. It's, accessibility isn't necessarily something that people take a look at as much, and particularly in housing. Yeah. So you're trying to find rent, and then you're also trying to find an actual accessible building that you can live in, and those are few and far between, especially if you're looking at that lower rental level. So what does every Canadian counts need to accomplish its goals? What are your next steps?
Yeah, we want people with disabilities, and this was what really helped out in Australia. We want people with disabilities to organize enough so that they will meet with their members of parliament to sort of demand something better. And, part of that problem is people can't even afford to get out the front door of their apartment to go talk to the members of parliament. But most members of parliament actually are very approachable. And I think if you're in their area, we want people to, one or two or three or four, to organize themselves to meet with the member of parliament, to hear the stories directly from the people with disabilities. We want them to email them. We want to make sure that 23%, possibly higher, of the people in Canada have a disability. So it's the largest minority, not just Canada, but the world. Why don't they have more? When they have such a large voting bloc and they start to say, hey, now if this member of parliament is saying they're going to help us, let's vote for them. There just needs to be a larger portion of the country with people with disabilities, and just think about all the caregivers and their families who would support that. So they need to get into, not a nice way, but they need to get into the faces of the members of parliament to say, we need a national disability insurance program that will cover my costs. Because like you said, what I had said earlier is, the family should be able to love their loved one. They shouldn't have to have that financial burden in addition to, it just doesn't make sense. That's up to the government, the Canadian society to pay as a whole.
And I think about new parents who have a child that is born with some type of disability, on top of all of the things that may be going through their minds at that point. I'm sure also includes, oh my God, how are we going to afford this? What do we need to be able to do? And how to get your mind around that? And if they had the knowledge that there was government support to help them afford what they needed to in order to take care of their child in a meaningful and positive way. That's got to be really fantastic for them.
I was talking to somebody earlier today, actually, and they have a daughter and with a disability, and they've been taking care of their daughter all these years on a waiting list, 25, 30 years. And their hope is that their daughter will pass away before they do, so that they know that their daughter will be looked after. And that's wrong. They worry about where their daughter is going to be. And unfortunately, right now, the way it's set up, you have to be in crisis to be able to find a place. So that's like they don't do that much anymore, about how people would drop their kids off at the hospital or respite or CPRI or something, where they would just say, Dad, I can't do it anymore. And then all of a sudden there is something comes up, but it's quite often not the best place either. So there's got to be a better way. And if disabilities, the costs of disabilities are looked after, then it would be so much of a better society. People would be healthier. In Australia, it added 2% to the gross domestic product of the country. So it's good financially, makes sense. It's a great place for so many more people hired. both, in the caregiver type roles or physiotherapists, or the people with the disabilities, the disabled people can get jobs. And I use that term both, person with disability, disabled person, because now there's two fences on what
I know.
you should name it. So I try to say both so I'm not upsetting anybody. But
yeah, we do the same with IWSCC. When people say, should we say disabled or persons with disabilities? And I say, well, it really depends on what side of the fence you're on. So, we do the same thing. We try to use both.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that disabled is a bad word.
Yeah.
And within the community, that is not the case.
No, and others, yeah. So there is two sides still. And so I like to say, when I have this opportunity, or if I'm writing something, I would use both terms, and I do that, and I say that on purpose so that people know that I'm trying not to disrespect anybody. Yeah.
So next steps then for Every Canadian Counts, or ECC, is getting that grassroots message out to everyone that you can, to say, this is here, this is something that is being proposed. Please go speak to your local politician in support of it, particularly if you have a disability. But I'm assuming that there's room for people without disabilities to be able to go and have that conversation and show support for the idea as well.
Caregivers, supporters, that's the big one. And also the ones that we're going after now. We have written a letter to the Finance Committee to be able to present to the government's Finance Committee. And now we're also getting more organizations like yours to write a letter of support, so that we can show that it's not just our idea, it's also association reports. And so this is sort of my pitch to you, if you would write us a nice letter of support.
Absolutely. I think we've already agreed to that. So we'll get the details.
Yeah.
So would it be helpful, IWSCC works a lot with large government and private sector corporations by purchasing organizations. Would it be helpful to get the message out to them? And would private organizations, banks, telecommunications firms, all those types of organizations, would that be helpful to get them behind this as well? And what could they be doing as a big animal, like one of those companies?
Yeah. I think, just, a logo on our website, a letter of support, so that it looks like we have, and we have some tremendous supporters already that are on our website. We have quite a few letters from groups now that will be attached, have already been attached, but we're going to add to that letter to the Finance Committee. And so the more that it's just awareness, like what we're doing today. The more we do of that, I'm quite active, personally on Twitter and the old Twitter, and
it's hard to know what it's called anymore.
On the new threads, and we have our Facebook, and but there's only a few of us, so the more that we can spread the word, the better. And
And so, can people contribute financially to ECC? That's beneficial as well?
It is, because for instance, we went to a conference in Washington, the International Developmental Disability and Mental Health Associations, and they have a thing around the world. So it was in Washington last year. So we went there. So if those, and just to promote what we're doing, it costs money. I went to Windsor to the building trades thing last week, and paid for it myself. Paid for the lodgings for 3 days. So I mean, it'd be good to be, from that point of view, to have more. And I don't do it begrudgingly. I think it would be nice to have it covered, but we could do so much more with media. We could do so much more going across the country, and it's what they did. But also the government can do that, you see. So we need, it's sort of a rock and a hard place right now. We want the government to say we're going to, and our ask really is about $6 million for the government to put aside $6 million to find out whether it's feasible, viable, and reliable to do a national disability insurance plan. So that's the proof, so that they can find out whether we want it, whether we need it. I've actually engaged with 4 students at the University of Western Ontario who are doing research into exactly that right now.
Oh, great.
So that if we can say, look, we've done the research, take it to the government and say, here, we've got this done for you already, or at least we've got some initial research done. So we're working on that.
So the more people and large organizations that can write those letters and make sure that their local member of parliament is aware that they're behind it, and so it's getting all of those voices gathered into one big voice to make the government really listen and stand up and say, okay, we're ready to sit at the table.
In Australia, it was actually Bill Shorten, who is now also was part of this big review, but he was in there from the beginning, and he was the minister that was sort of put in responsible to finding out exactly the feasibility, viability, reliability. And he went across the country as a politician and other groups helping. And then when they were done that, they said we absolutely need it. So when they were done the study and they did the education, because people don't know about it, so once people find out about it, there was actually, I believe, close to 85% of the population of Australia voted for it in a referendum.
Wow.
And when it came to Parliament, all the parties voted for it.
Okay.
So we need to get to that point where everybody knows about it and sees it as a good idea, because everybody can relate to it. That's why we call it Every Canadian Counts. You don't have to have just a disability. You could be the caregiver. You can be the friend. It could be for your grandkids. It could be for your kids. So disability affects everybody. And I think that's why in Australia, they have what they call Every Australian Counts. So we are trying to follow that model a fair bit and just make it better than what they have.
And so if you're looking at what you had suggested might be somewhere in the area about $350 a year per worker to help support this essential insurance, I guess, for folks with disabilities. For those of us who are really, really willing to take a look at what might be in our future, you could almost look at that as a bit of a pension plan, because if you're going to wind up with a disability, you'll have some coverage. And I know that so many folks that are, say, in my mom's friend group who are getting a little bit older and also concerned that something will happen that will have them wind up being in that area where they'll require some additional care, long-term care, whatever that looks like. That might be something that might help them feel a little bit better about approaching that point in their life if they know that there is some financial support available to them from the government.
Yeah, there is that one catch. Yeah, when you said maybe what's missing in the plan is that if you are on the plan as born and you continue on the plan, then it's covered. But if you have a disability after you hit 65 in Australia, then it's not covered.
Okay.
So, and they have done other things, I think, to improve the situation for seniors. But and I think the same here, once you get to the senior age, they have other things in place.
Okay. So
I think that's a place to argue for senior benefits and those types of things that you need more of at that point. But you're generally speaking, because otherwise it gets to be a plan that totally replaces all medical plans. Yeah. So they sort of looked at it has to be sort of a start and include long-term care, all long-term disabilities from cradle to grave, as long as you're on that plan going into that.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's still good. I mean, still you could, it still carries on with whatever disability you had after 65.
Right.
But that's the way it works there.
Okay. And that's what's going to be ideally mirrored here in Canada, that setup?
Yeah. And if seniors need more, then look at the existing things that are in place to improve those for seniors.
Right. Yes. We all know that that can definitely be looked at for sure.
Yeah.
I know that you had mentioned when we were getting ready for this podcast that you had a bit of a PSA or something that you wanted to share with our listeners. So now is the time for that, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this was, and I don't mind mentioning Cam Wells with his CJAM radio show. He wanted to put a public service announcement across Canada. So he said, but you can't go over a minute. So So I'll do the public service announcement.
Okay.
And which I think, some people said, well, how long do you need? So give me about 30 seconds and I can explain it in one sentence. So here we go. So 3 million Canadians have either severe or very severe disabilities and is the largest minority group in the country and have been made the most vulnerable by ignorance, neglect, and government policies. The current support systems are massively inefficient due to fragmentation, underfunding. They're inadequate to task, have long waiting lists, are inconsistent in application of benefits, inflexible in delivery, and are nightmarish to navigate for every province and territory. The support systems also suffer from a lack of standards and inadequate data. That's a lot of words to simply say disability support and lack thereof is really, really messed up in Canada. What's critically needed is a publicly funded national disability insurance support plan so that all persons with severe and chronic disabilities can finally receive the support they need and they justly deserve. At Every Canadian Counts, we have a proven plan on how to achieve this goal. And our website is everycanadiancounts.com. And you can email info@everycanadiancounts.com.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to have you here. I think it's a fantastic idea, especially working in the area of disability so much in my life that, I think this is well needed. I'm glad that Australia kind of jumped in and with both feet and gave it a try. So we have something that we can be working from, and really, really happy to have you here and sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And the one thing I think I forgot to mention is in Australia also they had something called disability tea. And we call it, have tea with your MP.
Okay.
And so I think that's a good little sort of a catchphrase that I'm hoping people will pick up on and invite your member of parliament to have tea.
So people can find out everything they need to know on your website, everycanadiancounts.com. And you said to email was info@everycanadiancounts.com.
Yep.
Okay.
And we do actually have a support button now. You can support, you can donate, but you can also add your name. There's a place where you can add your name to our goal of a national. So it just says we support a national disability insurance plan.
Fantastic.
So people can have their name there, and that would really be beneficial. It's not, let's say, an official petition for the government, but it's just a sort of gain that we can say, we want to get up to about 5,000. I think we're about 400 right now. We started it about 3 weeks ago. And so people can add their name, and it'll just help to show that we have support for this across the country.
Okay, that sounds great. I'm heading over right after this to add my name to the list.
Good.
All right. Thank you again, Hubert. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Deidre. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for being here and listening to this important information about Every Canadian Counts. For more information about IWSCC and supplier diversity, support for disabled as well as veteran-owned businesses, you can visit us on our website at www.iwscc.ca. You can find us on YouTube for these podcasts or listen in on your favorite podcast platform. Once again, we'd like to thank Maple Communications for supplying our ASL services, and RBC for sponsoring all those costs for our 2023's ASL services, and Pod Supply, of course, for producing our fantastic podcast. We'll see you again. Have a great day.